Hi, good evening. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Zanna Gilbert. I'm a research specialist at the Getty Research Institute. I'm also one of the curators of Making Art Concrete, along with Andrew Perchak, Aleka LeBlanc, Tom Lerner, and Pia Gottschalker. We have the show up as part of Pacific Standard Time, Latin America in LA, and it's going to be up until February the 11th. I hope some of you have been able to see it tonight as we had the extended opening hours. Now, I think I have some images. Right, this is the entrance. I'm really happy tonight to have Christopher Dunn, the professor at Tulane University in New Orleans. He's one of the foremost researchers on Brazilian dictatorship-era cultural politics, including popular music, race relations, and black culture in Brazil. He's the author of Brutality Garden, Tropicalia and the Emergence of Brazilian Counterculture, and Contracultura, Alternative Arts and Social Transformation in Authoritarian Brazil. His research has chronicled the intimacy of the connections between concrete poetry and popular music, and we're looking forward very much to hearing him speak a little bit later. I wanted to just say a few words before we start the screening about the exhibition and the event. The exhibition includes works from what was called by the Argentine artists in Argentina the heroic period of concrete art. And I'm sure many of you have seen the exhibition by now, so I'm just going to walk you through this. The days of concrete art's early inception in Montevideo in Uruguay and Buenos Aires in Argentina in the 1940s, and in Sao Paulo and Rio in the 1950s. The exhibition is one of the outcomes of a 3-year research project that has explored the techniques, materials, and working processes of concrete artists, and it's a collaboration between the Getty Research Institute and the Getty Conservation Institute with partners in Argentina and in Brazil. Another aspect of the exhibition, especially represented in the third small room, is the interdisciplinarity of concretism, from the way that artists engage with poetry and design, even from the beginning of the movement in Argentina in the 1940s. The show's events program has been dedicated to the ways in which artists engage with genres beyond painting and sculpture, that were beyond the scope of the exhibition, something that is central to the later development of neo-concrete art, which entered fully into the social realm of public space and the participatory practices, and also how concrete poetry was developed in the movement poema processo, or process poetry. So these issues sort of address questions that arose in the 1960s and 1970s as a result of the dictatorship in Brazil. As part of this effort to explore these questions, we held an event in October called The Concrete in Poetry and Art, considering the dialogue between poets and painters. And tonight we want to look at the development of the concerns of concretism in music and moving image works, from poetry to performance. I'm going to show you some images from some magazines that were printed in Argentina in the 1940s. The fullness of the initial engagement with artistic genres, from theater and music to industrial design, became a central part of the Argentine MADI movement, which was part of the concrete movement more broadly. Esteban Eitler, a composer and flautist, composed concrete music, such as MADI compositions, which is one of the works we're going to hear at the very beginning. So this is a kind of introduction. We're going to have, at the very beginning of the screening, we're going to have 2 works by Argentine artists, not Brazilian artists, that show this early experimentation with music and with film, by Esteban Eitler and Ana Sacerdote. Ana Sacerdote's beautiful hand-painted film, Essai de couleur animée, was not a central part of the concrete art movement, but any screening of concretism would be devoid without it. She was a member of the Arte Nuevo group in the 50s, and she published a magazine with some of the concrete artists that are included in Making Art Concrete. But it's a kind of prequel to the later Brazilian experiments. And it's, as far as we know, the only surviving film of Argentine concretism. So we're going to play these two surviving Argentine precedents before the program of Brazilian films. In Brazil in the 1960s, artists and poets began to depart from their austere concrete aesthetics. Let me scroll through these. Just Esteban Eitler is there on the right. He's been sort of collaged onto the scene. And then these are examples of the works in the show. Raul Loza, Geraldo de Barros, and this is a concrete poem by Augusto de Campos. They're all examples of this kind of more austere concrete aesthetics of the 1950s. After the 1960s, they began to depart from this program and began to embrace a variety of different media, including film. At first, like Esteban Eitler, there was an interest in atonal music and other modernist abstract music. But these interests and connections gradually began to open out to the new experimental popular music encompassed by Tropicalia. While there's clearly a shift from the concision of the 40s and the 50s, tonight I want to suggest that as much as a new aesthetic is formed in the 60s, the seeds of these experiments are already visible in the earlier concrete explorations of poetics, music, theater, and dance, in the emphasis on sound, in concrete poetry, and that the initial unbinding of the artwork from its frame in the marco recortado, and later the non-object of the Brazilian artists, began an unstoppable course of sociability in the concrete artwork. Finally, I just want to say a very big thank you to Sofia Serrano, who's a research assistant at the Getty Research Institute. Her knowledge of media has been indispensable to the project, and she was able to ensure that all of the works you're going to see this evening made it here. To Chelsea Larkin for organizing the event and our wonderful AV team, and to Rani Singh, formerly of the GRI, for supporting the project initially. Also to Mrs. Betty Duca and Nancy Perloff, and also to my fellow curators for enabling me to pursue the program. So we're going to start the screening now. Just one word on the final film. It's a newly restored film in 16 millimeters, and therefore there aren't any subtitles. I just want to point out that the narration isn't highly important to understanding the film. It's more interesting to watch for the kinds of artworks and the scene setting, but we'll provide some sort of schematic translation after the screening of that piece. And then after the screening, Christopher Dunn is going to give us a brief presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A. Okay, thanks very much.
All right, I think that's the end of the audiovisual material. I have a little bit more to add to that, but I wanted to say a few words. But before that, I'd like to thank Zanna Gilbert for the kind invitation to come out here to Los Angeles and participate in this event here at the Getty Research Institute in conjunction with this wonderful exhibit, Making Art Concrete, which I had the opportunity to view today. And so the title of our event tonight is After Concretism, Audiovisual Experiments in Brazil. And I believe I was invited because I wrote a book about Tropicalia, which came after Concretism, and then another book that was kind of about this post-tropicalist moment in the early 1970s that I connected to the counterculture. But before getting into all of that, I thought it might be useful for some of us to talk a little bit about not so much what came after concretism, but what came before, to contextualize some of this materialism, some of this material. So the prime sort of frame of reference for this generation, right, that comes of age in the 1950s and 1960s, was the sort of generation that came before, of course, and that was connected to what is known as modernismo brasileiro, right? And this was a movement, a cultural movement that occurred primarily in the 1920s, or emerged in the 1920s. And they're basically, it's a complex movement, as you might imagine, but there are basically two things to take away from what modernismo was all about. First of all, it wanted to bring Brazil up to date with the formal experiments in art and literature in Europe and to some extent the United States. And so it was it positioned itself as an avant-garde movement that had a true sort of dedication to formal experimentation. At the same time, it wanted to position itself resolutely from the point of view of Brazilian avant-garde, right, and to assert what was unique about Brazilian culture. And so often, and you see this mostly in the realm of visual art, and by the way, the MoMA is about to open a retrospective of the great painter Tarsila do Amaral that shows this very well. And one of the major themes there is a celebration of Brazil's mixed and multiracial identity. A second moment in that modernist generation kind of comes more into play in the 1930s, where artists become more dedicated to a project of social critique, of poverty, labor exploitation, and social inequality. So this movement, so that combination of sort of the looking at what is distinctive about Brazil, a celebration of its multiracial composition, if you will, but also at the same time pointing out the forms of extreme social inequality that's also regional as well, are something that are factors that sort of define the Brazilian modernism of the 1920s. A key figure in this, and this is important because he's a key figure for the concretists, is Oswald de Andrade, the great modernist poet and fiction writer as well, and also kind of a provocateur who wrote the main manifestos of the period in the I should say he wrote two very important manifestos during the 1920s. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about them other than to mention the anthropophagia, or what is known as cultural cannibalism. And just to sort of gloss that very quickly for those of you who are not familiar with it, is that this was a theory in a sense, or a metaphor that drew on inspiration from indigenous Brazilian groups that going back hundreds of years, no longer of course in the modern period, but back in historically practiced forms of ritual cannibalism by consuming the flesh of vanquished enemies. And Oswald de Andrade proposed the figure of the defiant bad savage, right, not the noble savage, who resisted colonial subjugation and Christianization. And in this manifesto, he suggests that there was something salvageable and valuable in European culture that could be appropriated and aggressively sort of digested to serve the needs of Brazilians themselves. And so it became a kind of a formula for this idea of resisting, on one hand, slavish imitation of dominant metropolitan models coming mostly from Europe, but at the same time not being overtly xenophobic and nationalistic. And so this would become a recipe, if you will, for creatively negotiating the sort of competing demands of nationalism and cosmopolitanism. And that brings us to this generation of the 1950s that is drawn in the post-war era to a constructivist avant-garde, particularly in São Paulo, which emerged under the banner of concretism. And so in visual art, and this is very well documented in the exhibit here at the Getty, we have the group Ruptura, right, which rejected the kind of naturalism and figurativism that was very common in the modernista generation of the 20s and certainly the 1930s. But they also eschewed, and this is interesting, the abstract expressionism in the United States of the post-war US, which they regarded as sort of hedonistic and irrational. And so they went with this language of geometric abstraction, which was indebted to a variety of constructivist traditions, primarily, well, almost all from Europe, right, and the Soviet Union during the interwar years. At the same time, almost simultaneously, a poetry movement, or poesia concreta, also took shape, led by the brothers Augusto and Hélio de Campos, and they, in much the same way that the visual artists pursued a language of abstraction, the concrete poets were interested in eliminating verse and subjective expression, and utilized techniques of graphic design to create what they called, and I'm quoting here, a poetics of construction, rationalist and objective against a poetics of expression, subjective and irrational. So they proposed this idea also of what they called the verbi voco visual, the simultaneous presence of semantic, sonorous, and optical elements. In other words, they were very interested in the simultaneity of the written word, right? That would communicate immediately, much in the way that advertisement did. And in fact, a couple of them actually worked in this field. So what's interesting about this, of course, and maybe this is a very obvious point, but that if you look at concrete art and concrete poetry, the element, you wouldn't guess that it was from Brazil necessarily. There's not those elements, those stereotypical references to Brazilian culture, right? It's very cosmopolitan, very internationalist, if you will, almost bereft of popular culture, certainly. And this is, again, in the 1950s. We see a parallel challenge in the world of art music, or música erudita, as they would call it in Brazil, led by a composer, an immigrant from Germany named Hans Joachim Kohlreuter, who rejected the sort of musical nationalism associated with Hector Villa-Lobos, the great Brazilian modernist composer of that modernist generation who lived until 1959. And Kohlreuter introduced the 12-tone technique of Schoenberg, and later the serial compositions of John Cage. John Cage, the myth is, and I don't know if it's the myth, the story that's told is in that last film that we saw, that John Cage is somewhere there, that John Cage was actually at that event. I've never identified him there in the film, but he's supposed to have been there at that time. And so, and again, the musical movement, this musical music was sort of resolutely, if not anti-nationalist, it was very much internationalist, right? It was not about appropriating motifs from Brazilian popular culture for erudite or art music in the way that Villa-Lobos did so brilliantly throughout his career. So at the same time, Brazil, again, the political sort of scene is important to talk about. This was sometimes referred to as this experiment in democracy following the World War II and before the coup of 1964 that would install a military regime that would last 20 years. So the 1950s are oftentimes remembered in Brazil as this period of optimism and developmentalism, a time in which the state invested heavily in education and social development, but also in infrastructure. So it's very much associated with the sort of ideology and the policy of developmentalism. And we have some sort of cultural expressions of this, if you will. And one, of course, maybe the most obvious is the construction of Brasilia, the great sort of futurist, modernist capital that was built in essentially 5 years between 1955 and 60, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, very much inspired by Le Corbusier, and went up, again, very quickly in the high plains of Brazil. Brasilia and bossa nova go hand in hand. Bossa nova was the great innovation in Brazilian popular music that took the basic rhythmic elements of samba and, if you will, distilled them down to its most essential form, and subtracted a lot of the percussion as well, added some of the harmonics of jazz to create a music that was exportable almost immediately. And again, not as a kind of not as sort of what the concrete poets would say raw material in terms of folklore, but something that they would have called a finished product, right? Something that was from Brazil and definably and clearly from Brazil, but at the same time very sophisticated in its in the way it had been formed and created and developed. And bossa nova very quickly in turn would have a great impact on the world of jazz. Stan Getz comes to mind, right? So Brasilia, bossa nova, and the World Cup, Copa do Mundo. Brazil wins its first World Cup in 1958. So anyways, if you just take those three things together, Brazil is doing really well in 1958. There's a lot of self-confidence. This new capital, they're living under the democracy led by a kind of a very nice populist gentleman named Juscelino Kubitschek. Concrete poetry is part of that, in this sort of idea that Brazil was a place that could produce the most experimental forms of poetry. So it was this idea of avant-garde coming from a country that was economically, at least, on the periphery. So concrete poetry is very much sort of positioned in that way. And at the same time, we have the emergence, and this is getting a little bit closer to the after concretism part, and I hope I'm not taking too much time, but which is a movement known as neo-concretism or neo-concretism, right? That was primarily manifested in the visual arts. We got certainly a taste of it in some of the films, and it emerged around a group of artists such as Lygia Clark, Hélio Oiticica, Willys de Castro, Lygia, Pape, some of the artists that we were introduced to today. And I'm just going to very briefly give a kind of a formulation that's somewhat schematic, but I think it explains the difference between concretism and neo-concretism. Part of it was the neo-concretists saw believed that the concretists from São Paulo were too rationalist, too scientific, too mathematical and geometric in their approach, and were interested in reintroducing the element of subjectivity and of subjective experience and sensorial experience, maybe above all. And so I'm going to introduce a couple of operative verbs here to try to just make a kind of a schematic claim here. So if we think of art in terms of the word create, creation is very much associated with a kind of romantic sensibility, the creation of a kind of the genius that is connected to a muse. So overturning that, the concretists, right, would have used the word or supplanted the word create with the word invent, right? That art was about inventing new things, right? With all of its sort of associations with science and technology. So if we take that in mind, then the neo-concretism would have replaced the term invent with this idea or the verb propose, right? and this comes up in one of the films that we watch, that art is a proposal, right? It's a proposal that would, in a sense, instigate or invite audience or participants, right, to engage that work on their own terms. Both Clark and Oiticica and Pape were very interested in transcending the limitations of pictorial space produced by the frame and releasing painting into space. And so, the main theme that comes out of neo-concretism is the participation of the viewer through the whole idea that's very well documented in this exhibit here of breaking the frame. And I have a few. Let me see here. I gotta push ahead here because I do actually have some. There we go. This is where I actually wanted to start that was just the preamble, but I'll go quickly. All right, now we're into the after concretism. So as it turns out, especially Hélio Oiticica has a big impact on a movement that was very interdisciplinary, that would have an impact on all realms of cultural production, known as Tropicalia. And in fact, this installation from '67 would serve as the namesake for this movement that would have its greatest impact in popular music. And how that all happened, maybe we can talk about during our conversation. At the same time, however, the concretists, right, the ones that were from Sao Paulo, right, that at least the stereotype was of these fusty guys that were really hyper-rationalists, became more and more interested in what they called the participatory leap, right, in their own work, but also in engaging popular culture and particularly music. And they were particularly drawn to this group of musicians attached to this movement known as Tropicalia, especially Caetano Veloso, for reasons that we can talk about perhaps later. The key figure here is Augusto de Campos, who actually started writing a series of publications, of journalistic publications, defending the Tropicalists in the press at a time in which, and the Tropicalists, it should be said, was a musical movement that was, again, very much inspired by the figure of Oswald de Andrade, cannibalistically devouring rock and roll from the United States and from England, but at the same time with the intention of creating something that was uniquely Brazilian. And Augusto de Campos was very supportive of this kind of move. The Tropicalists themselves were in turn inspired by the concrete poets, and particularly influenced by them. It was Augusto de Campos who actually introduced this young group of musicians to the work of Oswald de Andrade. And in 1968, they actually, here. I was supposed to introduce that, but let's listen to the music. I'm going to just talk a little bit over it. So this is their concept album from 1968. As you can see, this song, Bate Macumba, is actually constructed as a concrete poem, as a visual poem. Not all concrete poems are visual, but this one is. And my understanding is it was written by Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, the two sort of leaders of the Tropicalist movement, and it was Augusto de Campos who took those lyrics and arranged them such that they would form an image that looked like a bat in flight, right? And so, the way it breaks up the discrete sort of phonemes of various words, producing a number of different references. So you have the reference to bat, right, the animal. You have a reference there to Batman, popular culture, comic culture. You have macumba, which is a reference to Afro-Brazilian religion, which also is there in the term oba, which is a term that has several different meanings within the context of Afro-Brazilian religion. And then yay is a term that was used at the time for rock and roll. Like from the Beatles, She Loves You, yeah. They called it yay at that time. And so it's this very interesting popular song, right, it's very percussive, but has the electric guitars, and combines all of these references from popular culture, but also traditional Afro-Brazilian culture. Another good example of this kind of dialogue, if you will, between Brazilian popular music and concrete poetry is actually this piece that was created by Augusto in 1972, Viva Vaia, which means long live the booing or long live the jeering. And where did that come from? Vaia is the word for jeer, to boo something, right? And why he created this? Well, in the late 1960s, there were these very famous music festivals that were televised. So we, here in the United States, usually have this idea of a music festival as being something like Woodstock. And these, in Brazil, were actually more like these competitions where singer-songwriters would come together and they would enter a song as the formal sort of entry, right, for that festival. And the audience, right, it was a live audience, but televised, would enthusiastically cheer the songs they liked or boo also the songs that they did not like. And as it turns out, that these tended to be events that were very kind of nationalistic and not so, at least in the mid-1960s, up through about 1967, not too kind to musicians that were integrating elements of rock and roll, like the Tropicalists. And so the Tropicalists were famously booed at one of these events, and it led to one of the great sort of speeches that Caetano Veloso gave to the audience at that time. And Augusto took this event as inspiration for this poem, Long Live the Boo, not because he was agreeing with the students necessarily, but I think that it kind of played into this whole idea of a participatory culture where people would go to an event and participate, even if it's in a kind of an aggressive and negative way. I feel like I'm running out of time, and so I'm going to skip over this next very quickly. There's another example I have here, and I want to kind of get to the last, there we go, the last segment so that we have time to have a dialogue together. So I'm going to skip one musical example and sort of fast forward a little bit to a post-tropicalist period in the early 1970s, which is the most draconian period of Brazilian military rule. By this time, the leaders of the Tropicalist movement, Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, have been sent into exile in London. They were arrested and exiled in late 68. They return in early 72. And by this time, the military regime had really tightened its grip even more than before. And it was essentially a full-on authoritarian state. In this context, you have a group of artists that actually kind of identified with what they were calling cultura marginal, right, or marginal culture that was kind of outside of the realm of the culture industry. And that was kind of part of the point. There was a lot of cultural production during this time that was, if you will, off the grid, right, and very much homemade. But at the same time, this group was very indebted to this constructivist tradition that goes back to the 1950s, and they lionized the concrete poets. So we have, let me go back, because I want to show you everybody who's in this group. This is this publication from the early 1970s. Oh, darn. Let me see if it'll help me. All right, I'm going to try. There we go. Okay, good. All right. So we have the Augusto de Campos, Décio Pignatari, Haroldo de Campos, right? And remember, these are the austere, rationalist, scientific guys, right, creating this poetry in the 1950s. And here they are in a publication that involves people like, well, we have Oiticica here, Lygia Clark, the neo-concretist. But at the same time, we have tropicalists, and where is Caetano Veloso? He's here, right? There he is, Caetano Veloso. This is Torquato Neto, who is one of the singers, one of the songwriters for Tropicalia. And then you have this emergent generation that's kind of post-tropicalist, led by this guy here, Willys Salomão, who is this poet and also songwriter. His brother, Jorge Salomão, Luciano Figueiredo, who's an artist in his own right, graphic designer, and Oscar Ramos. And then this guy here, Ivan Cardoso, who's a creator of kind of underground films, right? But that are sort of very low budget, right? And even what we would call like B-grade films, right? And it's kind of all together in this very interesting encounter between the sort of constructivist tradition and what we might call the counterculture. And this is something that I talk about in one of the chapters of my book. And so these are just some of the pages. We have the concrete poets. There's Caetano with the monument to the boo, right? Viva Vaia. We have a contribution from Oiticica. There's Willys Salomão drinking gasoline over there. And we have finally then this underground film movement involving Ivan Cardoso, whose greatest work is Nosferatu no Brasil, right? Nosferatu leaves Hungary and comes to Rio de Janeiro in 1971. Over on the other side there is a still from the great underground film Família do Barulho by Giulio Bressani. And I feel like, I don't know if we can just stop there, and then if we have time, I actually have a clip of the Nosferatu do Brasil if our discussion takes us there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was our mistake to ask you to speak for such a short time because it's, an extremely rich subject, and it's also a very broad span of time, and
right.
There's a lot to discuss, and unfortunately we're not going to be able to do it all tonight.
Right.
But one of the things I wanted to pick up on that I think runs through the whole of the program and what your presentation is this kind of a meeting of high and low and
right.
Question of popular and erudite, and the sort of interesting melding, but also the sort of separation of those realms as well. And one of the things that we talked about earlier was in the last film, where you see this kind of attempt to claim, the people are the creators, and that there's this kind of act of liberation and creativity, and that was, the kind of what the neo-concretists and the poema processo people were seeking, but that the sort of awkwardness that you see in the interactions betray the fact that there's actually really strong class divisions, and comes across a little bit, especially to a kind of 2018 US audience, that this is kind of like fetishization of the favela and the black body and all of that. So I wondered if you would mind going a little deeper into that, kind of how radical it was to them to try and break these boundaries, to move themselves away from the kind of erudite culture of a very class-based art world, which it still is in Brazil. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that you're absolutely spot on in pointing out the sort of limitations of some of their gestures, and there's no doubt about that. And the person I think that's so key here is Hélio Oiticica, and this is what I want to say about Oiticica's who is this artist that came up through the sort of concrete and neo-concrete movement, comes from a middle to upper class family of intellectuals living on the south side of Rio, and it's in the early 1960s, I think specifically in 1964, that he has this sort of participatory turn, right, where he goes, first of all, he starts to frequent and spend time, and in fact spend, sort of live for periods of time in the favela Mangueira, which is known, it's one of the most well-known favelas or high-density neighborhoods, predominantly black, in Rio, and it's famous for its samba school, Mangueira, the one of the first samba schools established. And he becomes more and more sort of interested in the culture around the samba school, and himself, part of it is also a period of self-discovery that is about, sort of thinking about his own body, right, as a body in motion, right, in a way that he had never done before. And so I guess, if sort of maybe in his defense, right, that for his generation, even though from our point of view today we look back on it and we can see it with perhaps more critical eyes, for that generation, the way that the favela was typically seen was as this sort of, in two ways, right? One was as a kind of reservoir of Brazilian folklore, of the true, authentic people that produced samba, and for many of them, they believed that they were poor but happy, right? And the great expression of that would have been the film Black Orpheus. Perhaps many of you know this film, right? That particular portrayal of the favela was kind of typical at the time. For others, the favela was a space of potential political organization, that the people were these potential revolutionaries, and if led by the right intellectuals, right, they could be revolutionized. And
you see the breaking open of the box. So in one of the boxes that the children were hammering open, it breaks open to reveal the slogan, "Viva as armas das guerrillas."
Right.
So long live the weapons of the guerrillas.
Of the armed, insurgency. But just to get back to Oiticica, and then I wanted to talk about that because that's really interesting in itself. There is this idea that the favelas were also these spaces of creativity, and that were it could be sort of an inspiration to avant-garde practice, if you will, right? That were not these spaces of nationalist cultural authenticity, but were these spaces where were profoundly sort of inspirational in terms of his own ideas about artistic practice as life experience, vivencia. Now, getting back to what you were just saying there, Antonio Manuel, that in itself is interesting because it's this idea that, yes, there's a little bit of pamphleteering going on there in terms of the call to the revolution, but it involves the gesture of actually smashing open this box, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's that idea of participation.
On the floor, nonetheless.
On the floor, right.
Taking the artwork to the earth.
So anyways, I think that, I don't know, the film is interesting, and I've just seen it now about 3 times, and I think that what I also saw is that a lot of those families there didn't necessarily I didn't feel like they were, it didn't impress me. I didn't have the impression they were coming down from the favelas. A lot of them looked like middle-class families from the Zona Sul. But mixed, though, right? And I think that there was a conscious effort, it looks like, and I don't know, but it looks like a conscious effort to bring in folks from the favelas, some of those samba dancers, and maybe their families, and then, sort of mingle there at the Aterro de Flamengo, which is right downtown, which would have been, they would have been accessible to these sort of more middle-class families from the south zone of Rio.
I like that you mentioned this ghost of John Cage
right.
Hovering over the proceedings there, because if you think about that whole event in relation to his proposals, then there's also this idea of kind of spontaneity or like the chance.
Right.
So then, like, giving up the artwork to, some kind of chance occurrence or something like that. And it's kind of nice to see it like that, that the artworks themselves are kind of still or flaccid or something, and then like they're being activated in some ways, or not. You see, people kind of not knowing what to do with them as well.
Right. I mean, these kinds of public events, it's hard to know, how people like what it really meant for them. But like even that opening series with Rogério Duarte, who's not a very well-known artist. He was a graphic designer, but he was known as, within the sort of tropicalist circle, as the kind of brain behind everything. Like he was an idea guy.
Oh, right? So this is the part where he's sort of proclaiming amidst these dogs that are crawling across the floor, and it's kind of like a metaphor for the subservience of people under dictatorship.
Exactly. And it's in a way that's not, I don't think he's hitting you over the head with it, but it's kind of there, right? There's also this element of danger, right? Because you have these dogs that are, trained to attack. They're attack dogs, that are just under the sort of control of this trainer, right? But yeah, a lot of it is oblique, and to what extent people kind of understood those messages is an open question, right? But it is an interesting event, and certainly for Oiticica, he claims that it was a pivotal event in his own, his own trajectory.
So before we just open it up to Q&A, I wanted to ask one more thing, because I think you documented really amazingly in your book the relationship between concrete poetry and the Tropicalia movement, and the way that they drew on the inventions of concrete poetry in their lyrics. And I was wondering if you have a sense of, sorry if this is like a tall order of a question, but what it was about concrete aesthetics, like visually, that Tropicalia pulled upon.
Right, and I think that it was less visual than aural and sonorous. I think that they were really interested in less the aspect of the visual that I showed here, because that's like that's like sort of the classic example, right, of like concrete poetry in Brazilian music. The other example I had is a little bit different. It comes from Tom Zay, and it's actually not a visual poem at all, but one that plays on the breaking up of words into these discrete phonemes that produce then a multiplicity of meanings, or several different meanings, and that's something that you also find in concrete poetics. And I would say that that's the dimension of concrete poetry that's most apparent, or the most heard, if in Brazilian popular music. And it's the sense of wordplay. So a lot of it is also sort of the presence of sound poetry, perhaps even more than concrete poetry. And that's actually kind of an interesting question that I don't know. I wouldn't know how to respond to it, but there is an interesting question about the relationship between concrete poetry and sound poetry. And I think that element of the play of words and then how they're vocalized becomes very interesting for Brazilian musicians, right? And of course, you have to remember that since at least, actually going back way into the history of Brazilian popular music, the sort of poetic element is very strong, and it becomes explicit in Bossa Nova, right? The great poet-songwriter of Bossa Nova is Vinícius de Moraes, who's not, by a long shot, a concrete poet. He's actually from this previous generation that's very lyrical, but he's a great poet in his own right. He was known as part of the generation of 45 that was more conservative, that actually the concretists were kind of responding against. But nevertheless, he was a great poet in his own right, and then began to work as a lyricist together with Antonio Carlos Jobim, right? The great, composer of Bossa Nova. And so by so with the emergence of bossa nova, you have very strongly this idea that Brazilian popular music has a kind of a poetic sophistication and beauty that's on par with the greatest sort of modernist poetry of the time. And so there's already that, even though it's not concrete poetry, although the concrete poets loved bossa nova for other reasons that we can talk about if people are interested, but this idea that Brazilian popular music had this great poetic tradition that it was drawing from. And so it made sense for them to engage with concrete poetry as well. But I think initially the connection was intellectual. It was Augusto saying, with all of his cultural prestige, saying, I really love what you all are doing with music. And a lot of that also had to do with the sort of specific cultural battles that they were waging at the time against a certain kind of narrow cultural nationalism. And he saw the Tropicalists as potential allies.
Okay, thank you. I think that people would like to see Nosferatu no Brazil, but let's...
Yeah, you want that? Okay.
Yes,
no, it's
please.
Wonderful.
Shall we let's take a couple of questions and then we'll play you out with Nosferatu no Brazil. How's
Okay.
that? Okay, so do we have any questions? Okay. Right here.
So it seems to me, is this on? That you're skipping Nova Figuração, and I'm curious about that kind of gap, because actually, and for people who don't know, that Tropicalia is on view in San Diego at the Museum of Contemporary Art, but so is Lindonea, and so that relation, that Lindonea by Rubens Gershman inspires a song by Caetano Veloso, and it was Gershman who designed the cover of Tropicalia. And so that is that relation you're establishing between concretist poetry and Tropicalia, aren't we missing an ingredient?
Yeah, no, that's a great question that actually opens up a whole other dimension of Tropicalia that is kind of outside of the scope of the concretist lens, right? And so that's why I didn't talk about it. And so that Tropicalia is a very complex movement and complex aesthetic, and I like to see it as this confrontation and collision between a constructivist tradition, right, that going back to concretism and working through the neo-concretist moment and anti-art and environmental art and the participatory gesture and all of that colliding with the pop aesthetic that's now global, but primarily associated with the United States, right? And to a lesser extent the UK. And that is very influential for the tropicalists like Caetano Veloso, right, especially, who goes to the Biennial of São Paulo in 1967, and he's introduced to the work of the pop artists, and particularly Andy Warhol, and it has a big impact on him. And this is something that he talks about in his memoir, Tropical Truth. That's this whole sort of other dimension of Tropicalia that pertains to the interest in mass culture, and also the kind of mass culture that was represented in these images that you would see, for example, in the newspaper, and that's where you get to Lindonea, right, by Rubens Gershman, right, which is based on it's not directly taken from the newspaper in the way that Warhol might have done, but it was a kind of imagination of a very flat, right, aesthetic of a working class woman that has been killed, right? And so there's this question of like how she died and was she a victim of domestic violence, all these things. And Caetano takes it up as a song, sort of trying to fill out that story of Lindonea, what happens to her. And what's significant about it is, without remembering the lyrics themselves, but it's set to a bolero right? Not to bossa nova, not to rock, but bolero. Why bolero? Bolero was considered this genre by that time in Brazil. Of course, it's a Cuban genre that was popularized in Mexico, was swept Latin America in the 1940s and 50s, but by the 60s, after bossa nova, was considered horribly passé and kitsch, right? And so that's setting that to a bolero was also about a kind of a gesture to a certain kind of kitsch aesthetic and kitsch, a repertoire of images that would have been associated with kitsch, right? That precisely, we never can think of Oiticica in terms of kitsch, really, right? I mean, there's like a certain kind of resistance to the image in Oiticica. It's about experience more than anything else. So you've drawn our attention to this whole other side of Tropicalia, which is all about reveling in images in a very ironic way, right? And there's no better example of that than the way that they elevated Carmen Miranda as a kind of icon of the Tropicalist movement, right? Who is also another one of those figures who, by 1968, was part of this past that was somewhat embarrassing for that generation. Caetano actually has a very well-known article about that published in the New York Times, no less, in the early 90s, called Pride and Shame, right? And it's about Carmen Miranda and why she was so interesting to the Tropicalists at that time. And in a way, why it became important for them to sort of recuperate her as this icon of Brazilian culture in all that she represented, right? So I know I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but it relates to the Lindoneia thing, which is this famous painting by Rubens Gershman, who's part of this group that's somewhat associated with neo-figurativism, which is working with a kind of a modified pop aesthetic, but very much about portraying popular culture in Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we were talking specifically about Tropicalia and visual art, we would have done that, but, because it's specifically kind of dealing with where concretism, this event was meant to specifically deal with, how concretism kind of developed and rolled outwards into the public and more participatory realm, then that's, the line that we're talking about, but it doesn't, I mean, Tropicalia is such a anthropophagic kind of movement in a sense,
right.
in that it's, it pulls on so many different things. But I think that would require like another event. Do we have any other questions? Okay, let's go ahead and watch Nosferatu in Brazil.
If I can, let me just introduce it very quickly. I won't be as.
We do have one more.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to know how we made the jump from 12-tone music into bossa nova. How it's almost like a regression. How did that happen?
Wait, let me see if I understand it. The regression from bossa nova to...
No, from 12-tone, we're going off in one direction, then all of a sudden we bounce back into a very kind of traditional form with traditional harmony and rhythm and all this other stuff.
From bossa nova to...
No.
From the 12-tone music that we heard.
Right,
He's sort of asking, how do we go from this kind of abstract modernist music, which is so experimental in a sort of classical sense, to
well, first of all, they're in different realms. Okay, so you definitely have this distinction there between these experimental musicians and composers that are interested in 12-tone and working through that as a kind of critique of this earlier modernist generation identified primarily with Villa-Lobos, but also his students, right? At the same time, then you have the realm of popular music, right? And that involves musicians that are Antonio Carlos Jobim actually does have classical training, but not in 12-tone, right? I mean, he's listening to Debussy, more than anything else. And so I think that there's that distinction. But what's interesting is what happens to that generation of erudite, if you will, musica erudita, right, or art music experimentalists. By the late 60s, there is this kind of sense of malaise among them. And I sent you this great collective interview with this group that was associated with a movement called Musica Nova. And it was kind of an avant-garde musical group that emerged in São Paulo, very much connected to the concrete poetry orbit, right, with manifestos. In fact, their first manifesto was published in Invenção, which was the concrete poetry journal of that time, after Noigandri's. But by the late 1960s, they give this collective interview in which they basically said, what's the point of making art music in Brazil? Like, what's the point of making this experimental, erudite music in Brazil when we have no audience, we have no state support, right? And we have the greatest popular music in the world. Because remember that Bossa Nova also has this idea that it's very sophisticated popular music, and it's harmonically sophisticated, and that it influenced jazz. And so they start to think about how they can become relevant. And so they're talking about being sound designers, about creating jingles, about creating soundtracks for film, and about engaging popular music. And they all do to some extent. Almost all of them do.
It goes back to that question of the high and low, right?
Right.
It's like to be high is to be completely removed from anything that's actually happening.
Right.
It's like,
right. And so the one that takes us further is a composer, arranger. He becomes more known for his arrangements, Rogério do Prat, who is part of this Musica Nova group, and he becomes the arranger for all of these tropicalist records produced in 68, 69, especially in the late 1960s. And they're absolutely genius in terms of their arrangements. So he plays the role of, who is the George Martin, that kind of role, right? Someone who's there with the ideas, and it works beautifully, really. And he's an important, and in fact, that photo I showed you of the Tropicalist, he's in there, right? I mean, he's a central figure there. But it also shows in which, on one hand, the struggles of the art music world in Brazil, right? And at the same time, the kind of opportunity that they had to participate in this very sophisticated musical scene that was, creating popular music.
I think we're going to run out of time. So let's play Nosferatu no Brasil.
Right.
So Ivan Cardoso, who made the film about Hélio Oiticica that you saw, was, as Christopher said, a B-movie and horror movie, right?
He was really into horror
So there's
movies.
this interesting but he was really good friends with Oiticica and the others.
So this is a basic story of Nosferatu no Brasil. So the first half of the film shows Nosferatu, that we're all familiar with, right? The vampire. He's in Hungary. He's in Budapest, right? And he's attacking women, right? And he's this horrible figure, right? Who's attacking these women, and eventually he's vanquished by a knight dressed in white, and he's killed. And he reemerges in Rio de Janeiro in 1971, and his whole attitude is different, right? He's still searching for blood, but he's a hippie, and he's good looking, and he has much better luck, right? And it's played by this is Torquato Neto, who was one of the main lyricists for the Tropicalists, right? And there he is, about to attack Scarlet Moon, who's a journalist, right, and part of this whole scene. And so the scene that I'm going to play for you now shows our tropical Nosferatu on the beach in Rio de Janeiro. All right, and I just think it's actually beautiful visually. It's on Vimeo if you want to see the whole film. It's about a half hour long. It's pretty interesting.
All right. Well, thank you
all right,
very
thank you.
much. And thanks all for coming.
Thanks to all of you.